As I said in the last video, one of the most important steps to the birth of macroeconomics was really measuring everything that we produced. And so in the United States, a guy named Kuznets developed the national accounts. And basically, it's a system used to measure uh, total output and expenditure in a country. And so output and expenditure are actually measuring two sides of the same coin. And so there are actually three different ways that we can measure GDP. So one is we can measure total spending on everything that we produce in the United States. And so that's the one we're going to look at mostly. And so you'll see we can divide up spending between consumer spending, investment spending, government spending, and then we have to adjust for net exports. We could also look at total domestic production, right? And so how much does each firm add to the production process? And so value added basically is just their revenue minus their cost of goods. And finally, we can also measure total domestic income, which is often referred to as gross domestic income. And so the Bureau of Economic Analysis, for example, looks at both GDI, gross domestic income, and GDP, and they're very close. Of course, when you're measuring a 17 or 18 trillion dollar economy, there are going to be some errors, and so they have some statistical adjustments, but they're very close. So we should also note that sometimes you'll see number two sort of measured in what we produce. And so we can divide that up between durable goods, goods that are meant to last, more than 3 years, non-durable goods, services, etc. So how do we think about this? Well, one of the things to the reason that we can have these equivalent measures of GDP is can be seen in the circular flow diagram, right? Where firms are selling goods and services to households, and households are providing the labor force to firms, right? So the value added by firms becomes income for the households, and the spending by households becomes revenue for the firms. Now, there's a couple big pieces left off of this circular flow diagram, right? So we need to think about both countries outside the country that we're interested in and the role of the government. So one thing that we have to do is adjust for imports and exports. So exports are something that we produce, but that get consumed or purchased in another country. Whereas imports are something that are produced in another country, but we buy. And so we have to add in exports and subtract imports. And often we'll just call that net exports. So exports minus imports. And then the government, we generally just use as another producer, right? And so we measure, the number of teachers and their salaries, the number of soldiers and sailors and Marines and their salaries, the number of bureaucrats working in Washington and various state governments and local governments. Now, we assume basically that the cost of production captures the value added. And that could be a bad assumption on both levels, right? So it could be, for instance, that creating a network of interstate highways creates a whole lot more value added than just the salaries of the construction workers and the engineers that built them. On the other hand, it could be if there's a lot of waste in government that people are getting paid too much and are not actually producing that same value. So it's just something to keep in mind. So as I said, most of the time we're going to look at the spending side of GDP. And so we're going to break up GDP into the component parts of who buys the domestic production. And so we'll sometimes refer to this as Y or just GDP, and generally it's understood to represent real GDP, so controlling for inflation. So we'll have consumption, that's expenditure on consumer goods and services by households. We'll have investment, which is expenditure mostly by businesses on newly produced capital goods, so equipment, buildings, etc. Includes inventory, so anything we don't sell, that goes into investment. It also includes residential investment, which is the building of new houses. So when we build a new house during the year, that goes into investment. If we sell a house that was built, 20 years ago, that doesn't actually come into GDP because it's not something we produced that year. So any sale of any used good, whether it's a house or a car or whatever, does not get counted in GDP. Then we have government spending, G. It's important to remember, especially in the United States, that we have three important levels of government spending. So there's the federal government, there is state government, and then there's local government. And actually, state and local government do more actual spending than the federal government. The federal government is mostly involved on the military side and on the transfer side. And transfers is another thing that is not counted in GDP. So a transfer means that you tax one person and give it to another person. So things like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, unemployment benefits, those are all transfers. And those happen mostly at the federal level, but are not counted in GDP, not counted in that government spending. And then net exports, or what's sometimes called the trade balance, which is exports minus imports. So X minus M. So C plus I plus G plus X minus M. And that's often referred to aggregate demand, right? It's the demand for everything that we produce in the economy. So on the left-hand side, GDP, that's everything we produce, and on the right-hand side is everything we buy. So if we look at the components of GDP, so this looks at the US, the 19 Eurozone countries, and then China. In the US and the Eurozone countries, they're pretty similar. Consumption is the biggest piece. The biggest difference, perhaps, is the amount of government spending. So it's higher in the Eurozone countries than in the US. And also the amount of exports and imports. So Europe as a whole has a slight trade surplus. They export a little bit more than they import, while where the US has a trade deficit. We import a bit more than we export. Now, China is actually a little bit different, right? So China has been growing very quickly, and one of the ways they've been growing so quickly is by increasing their capital stock. And the way you increase your capital stock is through business investment. And so investment in China has taken up almost half of GDP recently, whereas consumption is only about 37% of GDP. And so we would expect that to change in the long run as China reaches the level of GDP per capita of the more developed countries like the United States and the Eurozone, because we think that there is sort of a limit to the benefits that capital investment can get you. But for right now, it probably makes a fair amount of sense for China to be investing heavily in their capital stocks. So if we want to know sort of how GDP changes overall, then we can do that by measuring how much each individual component has changed and then multiplying that by the share of consumption in GDP. So for instance, in 2009, that was the worst year of the recession, and GDP shrank by almost 3%, right, by 2.8%. And we can see that both consumption and investment in that year were negative, but investment actually contributed more to the GDP shrinkage than did consumption. And we're going to talk about that in just a minute. The reason is that investment can be much more volatile than consumption, right? If you decide, okay, I'm not going to consume this year, that's going to be a problem because that means no food, no clothing, no housing, you're going to die. If a firm decides, okay, we're not going to invest this year, they're probably going to be okay, right? They can probably do that for a year, maybe even two, before they decide, okay, economic conditions have picked back up and we're going to start investing. So the reason that the recession wasn't even worse than it was partly because of government spending. So government spending increased at the federal level, although it shrank at the state and local level, and because of net exports. So exports increased and imports decreased, which means that net exports actually contributed positively to GDP growth in 2009. So if we look at fluctuations, right, the causes of recessions and what changes the most during recessions and expansions, if we look at sort of pre-industrialized countries, then agriculture is one of the more volatile things, right? So weather plays a strong relationship to agricultural fluctuations. And we can see that agricultural fluctuations could be 20, 30, 40% in Britain in the 15th and 16th centuries, right? And so they were really the most volatile pieces. Industry was less volatile, services was even less volatile, and then GDP, of course, is sort of the weighted average of those two. If we look at India, then we can see that, agricultural fluctuations are still very important, although a little bit less so than they used to be, right? And so India started sort of really growing in the 80s and then early 90s, and we can see that, even though agricultural fluctuations are still pretty large, right? They can be 10, 15% of GDP fluctuations are much lower. So when we want to think about what is going on with these fluctuations, we sort of think of them as shocks, right? Something that happens that is unexpected. So from an agricultural point of view, it could be extreme weather, right? We had a really good harvest because of lots of rain and sunshine and good weather, or we had a really bad harvest because of a drought or a frost or something like that. So when we think about shocks, we want to think about two different types. One that can happen to an individual household, right? So you lose your job, you uh, sell a lot, you have good fortune or bad fortune strikes the household. On the other hand, we could have good or bad fortune that strikes the entire economy, right? So like the financial crisis was something that really struck the entire economy in 2008 and 2009. And so for household shocks, we can have some sort of insurance policy, right? We could just self-insure. We could say, all right, well, in good years, I know I should save a lot of money. And then in bad years, I can use that savings, or if I don't have enough savings, I can even borrow maybe. And so with self-insurance, you're just doing it yourself. Co-insurance means that you're relying either on a social network or government, right? It could be friends, it could be relatives, or there could be a government program in place that allows you to, for instance, collect unemployment insurance or collect food stamp benefits when you have bad luck. And so the idea here is that households like to smooth their consumption, and also that they are, at least to a degree, altruistic. You're willing to pay taxes in order to pay for unemployment benefits, for food stamps, or you're willing to help out a friend or a relative if they have bad luck. They can come, uh, you know, come over to your house for dinner. Maybe they can even stay with you for a while. So household shocks, not too difficult to deal with. Economy-wide shocks can be very difficult to deal with because they can be affecting lots of people at the same time. And if lots of people are hurt at the same time, they're not going to be able to help each other. And so this is a problem because this is when coinsurance is even more necessary, but makes it more difficult. In a modern industrialized economy, that means that we need to have programs like unemployment benefits, like food stamps that help people when we have a recession, so that they can, pay their bills, they can eat, etc. A lot of this is based on, trust, reciprocity, and altruism, um, and people being willing to pay for those taxes or help out people when they're down on their luck.